Population decline is an issue that's been talked about a lot now. Japan, South Korea, Germany, these are some of the names we hear as their fertility rates are very low. The United States also doesn't have the best of stats when it comes to birth rates, but we don't hear the US's name when we think of those that might suffer. And that's because the US has a few strategies that many countries are just unwilling to adapt. It's not a surprise, I'm talking about immigration. The birth rate of 2.1 is considered the replacement rate, where 2 is to replace the parents and 0.1 accounts for factors like child mortality rate and other population losses. If a population falls below the replacement rate, the overall population is likely to decrease over the course of time. The US has a fertility rate of around 1.6, which is below the replacement rate. The same is true for several big economies in the world. The population in the US actually increased by around 2 million people in 2024, and all of this has to do a lot with immigration. The US files around 1 million green card for permanent residency every year, and this number has been somewhat consistent since a very long time, in exception to a few years due to COVID. A lot of people who get this permanent residency, or ones that get citizenship, are people from the developing world. And it does seem like people from the developing world have a greater tendency towards childbirth than people in the West. So this does somewhat prevent the numbers from going down. The United States has clearly recognized immigration as a standard, even historically more than other countries. The rise of current narrative against illegal immigrants and asylum seekers is one that might make people believe that immigration is going down in the US. But keep in mind that asylum seekers only constitute about 2% of people that are provided with permanent residency. To assume that ongoing rhetoric against illegal immigrants would somehow just transform the entire system and massively reduce the number of people coming in would actually be quite naive. Plus, if you look into the places with most amount of immigrants, California, New York, or Miami, you'll find that these also happen to be cities with some of the highest level of acceptance of immigrants as well as the culture of immigration as a whole. These places have a grounded perspective that US is a country with an economy that's largely supported by immigration. But most importantly, the American market seems to be big enough and competent enough to sustain an influx of large number of people. It's largely decentralized. Canada, on the other hand, utilized immigration as an urgent fix to their problems of population decline. But it suffered immensely from scarcity of vacant homes. Most immigration was centered around major cities like Vancouver and Toronto, where the housing prices just went up. And Canada had to recently announce that it will reduce its immigration targets in certain regions due to growing concerns about housing shortages and infrastructural constraint. Canada has historically been pro-immigration, but this shift highlights the challenge of balancing immigration with local capacity. And we see similar debates in different parts of Europe with high immigrant populations as well. EU also has job market issues, as a large part of their jobs that immigrants would enroll in are concentrated in major cities. So once again, you go back to problems of housing cost increasing and sometimes even difficulties in finding jobs in the first place, which means difficulties in providing jobs from government's end. And that also means they can't take in immigrants rapidly to combat the problem of population decline without fixing their markets first. The US, like I said, simply has a bigger market, more urban areas as well as suburbs, and it also seems to have more land in major areas that when utilized for housing, it wouldn't really take up the housing prices like it did in Canada. If we compare the US with South Korea, Japan, and Germany, the US has the slowest decline in birth rates. South Korea has the most rapid decrease. It went from 4.5 in 1970s to approximately 0.72 in 2023. Japan and the European Union have similar trends, though their fertility rate in 70s wasn't really as high as South Korea. But the US has fertility rates that decreased somewhat moderately, from somewhere around 2.48 in the 70s to somewhere around 1.6, 1.7 right now. And once again, immigration has been a big part of this. Other countries like South Korea and Japan are largely homogeneous, so immigration can be a compensating factor for their problems of labor shortage, but it's never number one on their list of long-term solutions. But it matters what the current status quo looks like. Take median age for example. The US stands at 38.3, which means half the population is younger than this age and the other half is older. Compare this with Germany, South Korea, and Japan, and you'll see a big difference there. Plus, the same three places already have a much lesser fertility rate than the US, which means the struggle to recover is probably higher. Let's look at the old age population. Once again, the US seems to be in a comparatively safer zone here. Typically, the working age population is responsible for supporting the old age population, be it directly or through their contribution in nationwide social security programs through taxation. If you have an aging population, it starts becoming harder for the government to support the older ones, especially through healthcare programs, which can be quite costly. So back to our point, the US has largely compensated for its declining birth rates with immigration, and so far, it seems to have worked. And with ongoing immigration programs, the US is buying itself more time. It's a strategy that doesn't seem to be a plan A for most countries, and if it is, it doesn't seem to be a plan that they're fully happy with. Now, this doesn't mean that the declining birth rate is not a problem for the US. It definitely is, and therefore, there's a good amount of public discourse regarding this issue. But the US certainly is in a much better position than most other big economies.